Please welcome Diane.
Thanks, Max. Hi, everybody. So I'm already mic'd up a little and have chosen not to do a room mic. So if you guys way over there can't hear me, please let me know. All right, good so far. Thanks to all of you for coming out today. And before I start, let me thank Zach Cruzy for inviting me here to begin with. We were Facebook friends, we'd never met. And also Ryan Clater for going out of his way and then some to actually get me here. I'm really pretty jazzed by what I've seen of Michigan State's commitment to comics, evidenced both by this annual comics forum and the fantastic special library collection of comic books curated by Randy Scott. I got a great tour, I got a great tour yesterday, and Randy pulled some pre-code romance comics for me to paw through, and so that was, and in fact, I was telling these guys that one of the reasons I accepted this gig, because I don't much like to travel anymore. I'm old and I like to stay home with my cats, was to see Randy's library, which I have heard about since the 80s, though he tells me he's been at it since 74, right? The fact that MSU also offers a minor in comic art and graphic novels is kind of remarkable in and of itself, but what's even more remarkable is that it's an interdisciplinary minor, a collaborative effort between the Department of Art History, and Design, you need to shorten that name, and the English department. And this to me is like absolutely the way forward for comic studies as a field of scholarship. But making that interdisciplinary thing actually happen in our universities usually takes some kind of miracle. So that's in part what I want to talk to you about today. But let me just say that it feels a little weird to be delivering the so-called scholar keynote speech. I am not a scholar. In fact, I'm really just a comics fan. At best, a dilettante scholar. I'm curious and I like to read. This is my brother-in-law's interpretation of my house. I have a very dear friend who is a serious scholar of both Shakespeare and comics. And about 6 months ago, when I mentioned to him that I'd been invited to give the scholar keynote speech here, his eyes kind of rolled so hard, they damn near jumped off his head, right? And if that's what my friend thinks about my doing this, I can only imagine what some of you might think. And I gotta warn you, this is not a particularly academic talk, though it's a little academic. But I will try to put it all in context by telling you a little something about comics, about comic studies, and about me, because, well, not quite, because I've spent my whole life studying comics. And I've watched this industry and this scholarship grow up around me, and I've had a small hand in both. 2018, I think when I sent you my bio, Zach, it was almost 40 years, but 2018, in fact, marks my 40th year of working in comics. Yeah, I started at 3. I started at age 23, in fact, having just dropped out of a PhD program in philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So yeah, in a past life, I was a logician, and a Canadian, for that matter. This was 1978, and the direct market was still in its youth. That's the specialty market of comic book stores. Now, when I was a girl growing up in the 50s and early 60s, the only girl I knew who read comics, let alone superhero comics, we bought them at a place like this, the corner newsstand or the local grocery. So for those of us who kept up our habit past the onset of hormones, the comic shop became a kind of mecca. Guess where I stole this, Andrea? So, appropriately enough, my first job in comics was at the comic shop in Vancouver, BC. And that's where my real education in comics began. And this was my first teacher, the late Ron Norton, who grew up not far from here, in fact, in Marshall, Michigan. And I'd actually discovered the comic shop 2 years earlier in 1976 and quickly became a regular customer, their only female customer. But hours of sharpening my brain during the week on Kant and Bertrand Russell sent me screaming to Howard the Duck on the weekend, which, you know, was itself philosophical, but a lot funnier. The comic shop provided a crash course in comics history, a subject that I now teach. And at that point, we were only 4 decades past actually the entire comic book industry. And every now and then, a copy would actually make its way into the store. You know, I saw it, I touched it. In those days, auction houses hadn't yet jumped on our bandwagon, and comics retail was primarily a collectibles business, with new comics then accounting for a mere 10% of total sales. So back then, before the Valkyries, as one of only a tiny, tiny handful of women working in the direct market, I spent hour after hour bagging, tagging, and learning to appraise collectible comics based on their rarity and condition from the Golden Age onward. And in fact, you'll see all those boxes behind young me there, and they were all bagged and tagged and priced and labeled by me on Thanksgiving Day one day when the store was closed. So this sort of specialized skill would, believe it or not, allow me to immigrate to Reagan's America in the early 80s with a job offer at Comics and Comics, then a 7-store chain in Northern California. And I worked at the Berkeley location with People's Park just outside our back door. So serving on the front lines of comics retail is a first-hand education in the business of comics, right from the ground up, from consumer to retailer to distributor to publisher, with communication at that time starting to flow both ways. And also at that time, as new comic sales soon began to overtake sales of collectible comics, Marvel and DC began to realize the value of the direct market to them. Monetary value, of course, but also informational value in terms of buyer demographics, consumer trends, and more. And this knowledge of the business would prove absolutely crucial once I became an editor. Long time ago. Comics and Comics actually gave me that first editorial job. Within 6 months of being hired, I set up a newsletter for all 7 stores. And this eventually morphed into a 32-page bi-monthly magazine loosely modeled on the Comics Journal with news, reviews, and interviews, but distributed free to customers at all 7 stores. Now, Steve Wozniak and Jobs were busy inventing the personal computer just down the road in Cupertino, but we didn't know that yet. and everyone still used typewriters. So the telegraph wire was written, then typed by me, by hand, every single issue, every single one of those 32 pages, with that text cut and pasted up around Xeroxed illustrations into design mechanicals and onto layout board, with a cover logo fashioned by X-Men letterer Tom Orzechowski, also from Michigan, by the way, and Tom, who graciously taught me the fundamentals of old style production, more knowledge that would become crucial later on. Comics and Comics also taught me about comics marketing and PR. Selling ads in the telegraph wire was mandatory. That's how the magazine paid for itself, and I hated having to do that. But it was my first networking experience, and I got to know various publishers and their sales reps, because in those days, sans texting or email, we actually talked to people, you know, on the phone, or met them in person, as I did here with Dennis Kitchen. Comics and Comics itself aggressively pursued public relations in the early 80s, employing its own full-time publicist. They were probably the only comics retail outfit to do so. And he was a real shark who despised comics, but promoted them ruthlessly, and from whom I learned just how unethical most PR really is, certainly his brand. However, on the plus side, that meant that we did a lot of in-store signings, for which I always volunteered to work, even on my days off. So when that same publicist refused to spend his weekend chauffeuring Jack and Roz Kirby to the various comics and comics stores around the Bay Area, you can bet I signed up for that job. In addition to hosting the Summer of Love, the San Francisco Bay Area had also been the home of the underground comics movement in its heyday, and many of those small press DIY comics of the late 60s had never made it across the border to me in Canada. But of course, they were still selling strong on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, so a missing part of my comics education got shored up there as well. The undergrounds gave birth to independent comics, and the early 80s finally saw the growth of competition to the so-called Big Two publishers, as the independents and the comic specialty market would expand in tandem, each one directly supporting the other's growth. Dean Mullaney's Eclipse Comics was right up the highway in Guerneville, California, where he was publishing a comic called Zot by some kid named Scott McCloud. The Shanis brothers had parlayed their art prints business into Pacific Comics in San Diego, enticing then 64-year-old Jack Kirby to create Captain Victory, and a young hot rodder they knew to dream up the Rocketeer. Gary Groth and the late Kim Thompson, who were publishing the Comics Journal just north of LA in Agoura, took the leap into publishing comics with an unknown trio of brothers and their magazine-sized comic book called Love and Rockets, whose rallying cry, or ad tagline, if you prefer, was "Bring on the women!" You know, all four of us. But these were heady times for comics. Things were changing in leaps and bounds, faster than a speeding bullet, you might say, or faster than a streamlined train, as Jerry Siegel originally wrote it. Most importantly, its politics were changing too, thanks in large part to creators like Neil Adams, Jerry Robinson, Will Eisner, Frank Miller, Alan Moore, all of whom at one time or another laid their jobs on the line by being vocal in public about the need for Marvel and DC to give the talent a fair shake. I'll never forget being at the 1992 San Diego Con, where Frank delivered a speech in honor of Jack Kirby, who was still alive then and in attendance. Frank's speech was addressed to Marvel Comics, and he just kept saying the same two words: pay up. I presume that most of you know, until the advent of independent publishing in the middle to late 70s, if you wanted to work in comic books, you signed away all your ownership rights, period. There were no other options. Let me say that again. You signed away all your rights. If you wanted to work in comic books, you had no rights. You barely had a contract. Work for hire was it, and more often than not, the so-called contract was a single paragraph printed on the back of your check. So you couldn't even get paid without signing away your own intellectual property, not to mention your physical property. Until the mid-1970s, rather than being returned to the creator, original art went directly to the shredder. Or in the case of Kirby, was randomly given away as a bribe or routinely stolen in order to upgrade someone's personal collection. Should I say this? I was in somebody's kitchen once in the 80s, and pinned to every front of their kitchen cupboard was a page of stolen Kirby artwork. The independent publishers, along with the competition they provided, were the tipping point here, with a business model akin to that of book publishing, which allowed for creator ownership plus royalties or a variable share of the profits from both the comic as well as any ancillary product, meaning toys or movies based on the comic, for instance. This changed not just the playing field, but the whole game, profoundly altering the traditional publisher-creator relationship in comics from master-slave to more of a partnership with respect for the creator at its foundation. That, of course, made having your work published by an independent company rather more appealing than selling your soul to Marvel or DC. And those big two publishers pretty quickly had to cave and scramble to follow the independent's lead. At least in terms of royalties, if not ownership. In the meantime, by January 1985, with recommendations in hand from Chris Claremont and Frank Miller, I'd graduated from comics retail to comics publishing and a job as assistant editor on Uncanny X-Men. I'll skip over the 4 days I spent at Marvel before quitting in sheer terror, except to say that in that brief time, Marvel's production manager, Virginia Romita, wife of John and mother of J.R. Jr., taught me perhaps the most valuable tool of my subsequent career: how to draft and enforce production schedules for comics. I'll also skip over the next 4 years, which I spent as editor-in-chief of a small independent publishing company located about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, except to answer everyone's burning question. It's pronounced Kamiko. I quit there too after 4 years when Kamiko's sibling owners refused to prepare for or even face the company's imminent bankruptcy, the result of their ridiculously inept but secret financial management, or mismanagement, more to the point. By the time Dark Horse Comics, then a company of only 10 people, moved my former husband Bob Schreck and me to Portland in 1990, I'd already begun jonesing to go back to school. But 35 years old by then and 12 years into a comics career, I wanted to pursue something that didn't exist yet: comics scholarship. Portland State University, where I now teach part-time under the aegis of the Post-Bac Comic Studies program, ironically turned its collective nose up at the very idea. Comics hadn't yet infiltrated the bookstore market, not in any serious capacity, and graphic novel was still over a decade away from becoming the gentrified term du jour among civilians. But the private Catholic University of Portland welcomed me into its MA program in communication, visual communication in particular, at a time when that was a relatively new area of study, which is the degree I would walk away with 3 years later, each semester taking one of the required 10 graduate courses at night, the last 2 of which consisted in writing my thesis, all while editing comics full-time at Dark Horse and long-distance romancing with Dave Sim, the insanely talented creator of Cerebus, who lives 2,500 miles away from Portland and who mercifully waited until that thesis was done before breaking my heart into 1,000 pieces. Immediately following up that neat trick with an infamous essay about the so-called female void. And although the study of comics could be shoehorned into almost all my communication coursework, and certainly into my master's thesis, the problem was finding secondary source material to read. I knew what I wanted to study, but there was no one to teach me. In a 2011 article for the International Journal of Comic Art, which didn't exist in the early 90s, Gregory Steirer lists 6 distinct approaches taken by scholars to the study of comics. But in 1990, the number was half that. The factual data-driven approach informed certain historical or encyclopedic texts of that time, but most of those weren't really very academic. I'm thinking here of French scholar Maurice Horn's 1976 World Encyclopedia of Comics, for instance. The undisputed best of what Steirer calls the sociocultural approach, using comics to reveal cultural values and social norms of a given social grouping, was certainly Rusty Wittick's 1989 Comic Books as History, about the work of Jack Jackson, Art Spiegelman, and Harvey Pekar. But in those days, most sociocultural scholarship about comics was consigned, in fact, most of the small amount of scholarship that existed was consigned to the Journal of Popular Culture, which ranked dead last on the scale of academic credibility, at least back then. A third of Steirer's approaches to comic scholarship was also in evidence back then. I blew my slide. The ideological approach, exemplified by exactly one text, Dorfman and Madelar's groundbreaking How to Read Donald Duck, Imperialist Ideology in the Disney Comic. Ideological approach. Sorry. That text was originally written in Spanish, and I couldn't get my hands on it anyway. This was pre-Amazon. In fact, pre-internet. And what I wanted to study was the form of comics, how words and pictures work together to convey meaning, how there's a gestalt to the page in comics and that it's often more than the sum of its panels. And what is a panel anyway? What is a comic? French scholars were actually hard at work trying to answer all those questions. And I even speak French. In fact, my early education was completely in French, grades 1 through 6. But neither my university instructors nor my comics industry colleagues were able to clue me into the extant Franco-Belgian scholarship. Who knew? In 1990, on this continent, cartoonists themselves were the only source for anything like formalist criticism. Yeah, the dreaded practitioner theorist, so-called. In the best of Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy, who'd have thunk, published in 1988, cartoonists Mark Newgarden and Paul Karasik gave us a charming little essay. How to Read Nancy was a non-academic, non-peer-reviewed article, but quite possibly the very first close reading and how of a comic, this one. Incidentally, while I was preparing this talk, which I finished last night at 2 in the morning, I came across the Newspapers in Education website, and this organization, despite providing some excellent teaching resources on its site, including an otherwise terrific handout on close reading, what it is, why it is, how to do it, dismisses the idea of close reading a text like Bushmiller's Nancy. Beth Burke, whoever she may be, authored the handout, and she doesn't cite Nancy specifically. Her target is Jeff Kinney and his Diary of a Wimpy Kid series, which, according to Ms. Burke, doesn't leave you pondering deep ideas or considering thought-provoking messages that go beyond the text, which reminded me of a few contemporary comic scholars and even well-known, well-respected comic scholars who similarly turned their noses up at the entire superhero genre. No matter the genre, comics is complex by virtue of its form alone. Traditional literary theorists continue to struggle with the complexity of a singular track of expression, words only. Ditto art theorists, but they're dealing primarily in pictures. Comics theorists, particularly those with a penchant for formalism, must take into account both words and pictures and how they cohere or don't within each panel as well as across multiple panels, which is another way of saying that comics is a multimodal purveyor of meaning. Nothing on this page is true. What do you do with that? But the formal complexities of comics range well beyond this intricate interplay between, as Charles Hatfield puts it, two codes of signification, one of which, by the way, the written text, might be wholly absent from a given comic, leaving the images to do all the heavy lifting of telling the story. And when they do, that is, when images multiply, whether or not accompanied by written text, they evince a very different and magical formal, well, set of formal properties related to sequence. The reader must connect the dots, so to speak, read through the images and infer connections between them. This, of course, is what Scott McCloud calls closure, as distinct from narrative closure, those warm fuzzies brought on by satisfactory story resolution. And in order for the reader to achieve comics closure, to make the connections between images in sequence, the author must divide the narrative into those images, choosing exactly the right ones that will enable the reader to make the right connections, a process we in the biz call breakdown. But if all that isn't complex enough for newspapers and education, which is where this digression began, there's yet another point I'd like to underline about comics form, specifically about comic book or graphic novel form as opposed to the form of comic strips. Because the process of breakdown involves not just breaking the story down into successive images, panels, in other words, but breaking the story down over a finite number of pages too, and configuring the panels on the surface of each page, by which I mean the cartoonist must choose not only the number of panels per page, but their size, their shape, and their arrangement on each page, while bearing in mind which pages fall on the left and which fall on the right. And this is known as page layout, and it gets back to what I mentioned earlier as the gestalt of the page, or the fact that in longer form comics, the page, as well as the panel, is a fundamental unit of storytelling. Or you can think of it as the panel having two functions in longer form comics, as an individual moment of time in a drawn sequence of such moments, and equally important, as an individual element in an overall page design. In An Art of Tensions, Charles Hatfield explicates all this in more detail, and he goes on to list a fourth formal complexity or tension of the comics form, but I'll leave you to read about that yourselves. His article, by the way, is an edited version of the second chapter of his 2005 alternative comics text, which I strongly recommend, because even a dilettante scholar can understand Charles's work, because he's such a clear-headed writer. All right, end of digression, please forgive. Also end of partial rant, though. I got more rants coming. But the point is, studying comics is hard. It's hard. And there are still otherwise smart people who just don't get it, including some students who register for our courses thinking it's going to be an easy credit, right? But back in 1990, studying comics was almost impossible. Understanding comics was only a glimmer in Scott McCloud's eye. Charles Hatfield wasn't yet Dr. Hatfield. He was still working on his master's degree. And before then, he was Charlie Hatfield, writing letters to comics I was editing. So aside from the very few previously mentioned texts, this left the comic scholar of the early 90s with cartoonist Bob Harvey's 1979 JPC article on comic strip aesthetics, which for obvious reasons was only partly applicable to the study of comic books, and cartoonist Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art, published in 1985. A serious work and definite forerunner to McCloud in 93, but in no way rigorous or academic, and not that McCloud is either. Point being, it was a tough time to be a comic scholar, even a dilettante. And that was apparent not only in the dearth of critical readings, but also in the fact that my own master's thesis required an almost chapter-length defense of comics as a legit field of inquiry. Remember those days? Actually, most of you not, because you're too young. Thank God we're past them. Yeah, you remember. Luckily, I know Scott, and about halfway through my 183-page thesis, altogether out of the blue, he sent me a photocopy of his next book, which wouldn't be published for another 6 months, and that book was Understanding Comics, which totally saved my ass. And without which, comic studies would not exist as an academic discipline today. This is the text that let comics sneak into the hallowed halls. But by the time I graduated, I was sick to death of those hallowed halls, and I took a good long break from comics theory, dedicating myself instead to comics practice, first as Dark Horse editor-in-chief, and then after stepping down from that position of endless meetings and memos, a few years later, as hands-on editor to Frank Miller, Neil Gaiman, Stan Sakai, and Will Eisner, among others. And it was Will who, returning from a guest appearance in 2001 at, I think, Ohio State, was honestly giddy in a phone call about a comics as literature course being taught there. You could do something like that, he said. Why don't you take that fancy degree of yours and go teach a course in comics? Well, when Will Eisner tells you to go out and do something, you just do. So I've taught that course in comics every year since. Comics history, comics memoir, female cartoonists, a course in Eisner Miller, and now comics theory, filling in for Dr. Susan Kirtley, Portland State's Director of Comic Studies, who's on sabbatical this year. But pitching that very first course back in 2001 was no easy task. Without a PhD, my obvious choice was the local community college, but the English department wouldn't hear of it. The art department, on the other hand, was much more receptive. So from 2002 through 2017, I taught what was essentially a comics literature course as an art department adjunct, and in fact titled the course Comics, Art, and Literature, bringing it into the Oregon educational system with its own dedicated course number for the entire state. And this was, I'm pretty sure, certainly the first ongoing course of its kind in Portland, which, if you guys don't know, is a town dubbed Comic City, USA by the Oregon Historical Society, now home to 4 major comics publishers and the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and a bevy of cartoonists. So in the last dozen years especially, I've watched comic studies grow throughout the extended Portland area, as well as throughout the country, and even internationally. But any good coming-of-age story finds its protagonist beset by growing problems. So I'll wrap up with certain cautions about the direction in which comic studies seems to be moving, along with some suggestions for the future of our field. First, while explosive growth of both the comics medium and its study is exciting for all of us, things are perhaps exploding a little too quickly. At Dark Horse, when I started in 1990, there were 10 of us working out of one room, half the size of this room. And now there are 150 people working there, spread over 3 buildings. But in the course of that, at the point at which the number of employees climbed to 40, that's when the toilet paper rolls started getting stolen or randomly disappearing. So the point is, growth comes at a cost. Now, my friend, Ben Saunders, who swears he didn't really roll his eyes at the prospect of my giving an academic talk, and allowed me to take his name in vain here today, Yeah, I think he's right. It's probably true that he didn't really roll his eyes at that. But you know, it makes for a good story, and all writers are liars in the end. Ben Saunders, director of the Comic Studies program at the University of Oregon, recently made the point that 5 years ago, he could pretty confidently claim to have read every comic studies text published to date. But now, 5 years later, he can no longer say the same. In fact, it seems that every time we look up, another text is being published in our field. Even Harvard University Press has jumped on board, right? A dedicated reader can't keep up with just the University Press of Mississippi books, let alone all the others. And as a dilettante, I'm a little reluctant to say this, but I'm 63, so I don't give a damn. Some of that scholarship is just not very good. I'm reminded of the black and white glut that came hot on the heels of Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. A glut that very nearly killed the whole industry. And the history of comics is rife with examples of genuine commercial and/or artistic success being followed by cheap imitation, and lots of it. So, on top of that, I'm actually appalled at the lack of solid editing in most comic studies texts, when even the reigning star of comic scholars, who shall go unnamed here, apparently doesn't know the difference between discrete and discrete and has no editor to fix that mistake for him. It reflects poorly on comic studies overall as a quote-unquote scholarly discipline. And let's face it, we have enough stigma attached to our field as it is. Through the years, as comic studies has migrated, in most cases, to the English departments of our universities, or as graphic novels have been discovered by English department instructors and incorporated into their literature courses, I've often seen the visual aspect of the medium go utterly ignored. Can you imagine an intro to film studies course that never once brings up the subject of camera shots? It wouldn't happen. I've taken quite a few comics courses now too, in addition to teaching them, always trying to learn pedagogy from professional educators. And signing up for all those courses I wish had been available to me when I was in grad school. And it's startling to me how many English lit teachers seldom attend to the visual nature of comics and its formal contributions to the narrative. Not you, Andrea. Lest we forget, comics is a visual medium, a primarily visual medium, I would argue, as do both Eisner and MacLeod. And when I ask various instructors why they don't address the visual impact, the answer is frequently something along the lines of, I'm not qualified to discuss the art, or I don't know enough about art. To which I can only respond, then learn, damn it. Really, I don't have any patience for that attitude, nor does it do our students any favors either. Comics is, by its very nature, interdisciplinary. As you guys have already thankfully realized here at MSU, it's not prose. It's not even mostly prose. So comics educators need to get the hell out of the kitchen if they can't stand the heat. In other words, educators should learn about this medium before deciding to teach it, I believe. And this points to another difficulty afflicting the study of comics, and that is the lack of agreed upon standards and methodologies. It often seems that each new comic studies text attempts to invent or reinvent the critical wheel each and every time. And this is partly the result, I think, of the fact that we're a brand new ballgame on the academic playing field, which means that MacLeod notwithstanding, it may just be too soon for us to have any canonical critical texts. But that shouldn't mean we ignore what is already written and has stood the test of time thus far, even if that time isn't very long by the usual measures. In a 2011 Cinema Journal article, Bart Beattie, way prolific comic scholar and now English department chair at the University of Calgary, another Canadian, also laments the absence of a shared critical vocabulary for comic studies, pointing out, in contrast, that one of the important steps toward institutional legitimacy for film studies was the push to create a specific grammar for writing about film. And comic studies' lack of same is a situation that continues today, with scholars borrowing terms from other disciplines, which I'm actually less concerned about than Dr. Beattie, so long as the terms fit. But I am concerned about scholars randomly creating their own jargon without regard to the work of other comic scholars, or more importantly, from where I sit, without regard to the industry's own vocabulary, a language with its roots in comics history and one that's accepted, shared, and in current and common usage. Why not adopt that? For example, the term speech bubbles makes my ears bleed. Talk about infantilizing the serious work being done both in comics and in comic studies. No one uses anything like bubble placement to describe the positioning of lettered dialogue on the comics page. Of course we call it balloon placement. In comics, people speak in balloons, word balloons. So why on earth do certain comic scholars whose critical endeavors are otherwise eminently worthy of respect resort to such baby talk? And I admit that that one's kind of a personal pet peeve, but one that's nonetheless widespread among my fellow members of the professional comics community. And when NPR describes a first-time cartoonist's 6-page comic as a graphic novel, and its author, who has never been published before that 6-page story, as a graphic novelist, there's a fundamental misunderstanding going on that's being communicated to every listener. I also regularly read about narrative boxes and paneling in academic journals, rather than captions and page layout and panel composition. The comics industry, just like the film industry, has developed its own vocabulary since the turn of the previous century, really, when comics began appearing in the Sunday newspaper section. Just like film theorists, then, comics theorists should adopt those extant terms, at least as a starting point, so that we can all try to speak the same language. Again, due credit here to Dr. Hatfield, who incorporated industry terminology into his own scholarship right from the start. It's not that hard. As a rule, I believe we should work to narrow the gap between theory and practice, between the academy and the industry, rather than encourage what Dr. Wittek refers to in a 2008 IJOCA article as the problem of dual address, by which he means that comic scholarship is largely under-theorized in order to appeal to comics practitioners. But in fact, I'm beginning to suspect that 10 years later, the pendulum has now swung completely the other way around, that comic scholarship may be over-theorized and certainly over-jargonized, precisely in order to alienate comics practitioners and or to elevate the status of critic to creator. And I know the latter is fashionable in postmodernist circles, but I think we ought to be a little wary of that. When the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Mouse, Art Spiegelman, who's quoted in that Wittek piece, doesn't understand half the academic exposition that's been written about his own graphic novel, I think maybe it's time to take a second look at how and what we're writing for those peer-reviewed journals read by, a whopping 5 people. And I'm one of those 5. So I hope it's clear by now that I'm actually sympathetic to the pursuit of scholarship. One of the reasons that I'm a paying member of the Comic Studies Society and read its journal Inks, in which your very own English prof, Zach Cruzy, was recently published, is because that organization embraces both comics academics and practitioners. At last November's ICAF conference in Seattle, I was horrified to hear a presenter publicly disparage practitioner theorists in general, including the 2 whose seminal texts are responsible for all of us being here today. By restricting comic scholarship to specialized scholars who maybe have never drawn a panel, rather than opening it up across disciplines or to other professions, to any and all interested thinkers who learn about comics, we run the risk of being the very snoots that we've struggled against in all our efforts to bring comics into education and out to the masses. And I don't intend that as an argument against rigorous scholarship, quite the opposite, in fact. Something else struck me at ICAF, several presenters speculating about the reasons for various business decisions, publishing decisions made by comics publishers, past and present. Historical research is subject to any number of obvious limitations, but in the case of contemporary business decision-making, I wondered, why not just ask the publishing company? In no way does that guarantee an accurate response, of course, but it might at least net the theorist some potentially useful information. Why did they renumber that comic? Well, I have this abstruse theory that, no, just call and ask. We'll be glad to tell you. Other ICAF presenters complained about the difficulty of securing publisher permissions to run copyrighted images. Well, it should be a little difficult. Comics publishing companies are legally bound by a contract to protect their creators' copyright ownership. That said, it's not so difficult to establish a relationship with a company rep. And once you do, those image permissions can be a snap, really. Dark Horse had a standard form to fill out, easy peasy, and in return, we requested a complimentary copy of the academic text or article to pass along to the creator in question, who had agreed to let his or her images run in the academic piece. And unfortunately, the academic press and or author too often didn't come through with their end of the deal, which is ill-mannered at best, but definitely not the way to maintain those relationships. From my pivotal point between these two worlds, what I'm advocating is simple cooperation, really. And admittedly, comics practitioners can be just as guilty as theorists of not taking the other into account. I'm proud to say that Portland State's Comic Studies program, thanks to Dr. Kirtley's almost superhuman efforts, actively supports this kind of cooperation by way of its internship opportunities. To date, the last 3 editorial hires at Dark Horse, as well as the last 2 editorial hires at Oni Press, are all graduates of our program who previously served as interns at these companies, learning the ropes and earning course credit at the same time. And on the other side of the coin, Dave Marshall, Dark Horse editor-in-chief, as well as my former assistant, remarked just recently that he couldn't be happier about the ready pool of potential candidates for hire supplied by PSU's Comic Studies program. Now, some of that more esoteric theory that we force down our students' throat is never going to teach them how to run a Xerox machine. But it does help them become critical thinkers and problem solvers, 2 essential characteristics of the successful comics editor, and the third one is learning how to run the Xerox machine. But it absolutely goes both ways. And I can personally attest to the fact that my own preoccupation with comics theory and form has without a doubt bolstered my current work as a literary translator, particularly when it comes to the complex challenges of interpreting the comics of Jean Giraud, known to most Americans as Moebius, or as they pronounce it in France, Moebius. So comic studies finds itself at an important juncture here, I think. We've grown significantly as an academic discipline, and despite our growing pains, in general, we've become more powerful. But as we all know, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. And it's to the benefit of all of us, theoreticians, practitioners, and those of us caught straddling both ends of that spectrum, to behave more responsibly towards each other and towards our field as we move ahead into what I hope will be more of a shared future. And to that end, we have a little homework to do. I didn't want to end on that sad photo of Spider-Man, so I thought I always put in a cat when you're anyway, that's the end. Thank you so much for listening. And I don't know how much time we have, but if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer any questions about anything, including Dave Sim.
Wow. That's big doings, gang. Yeah, so we have 15 minutes left, so open it up to you, to your friends, for questions.
Oh, that's easy. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, especially at the end with the state of comic studies and looking to the future. You mentioned Harvard University Press. I was wondering if you could, the state of the future of comic studies, could you talk a little bit about academic work, theses, in the form of comics?
Yeah, of course. Nick Souzanis' Unflattening. I'm not familiar with any others, but I'm actually teaching Unflattening this year and having Nick Skype into the classroom because he's got a lot of really interesting things going. He's currently on this kick about visual thinking and how thinking visually sort of, goes off from our regular linear mode of thinking. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what your question is. Are there more? Should there be more?
Well, it's more specific. So I have a student who wants to do an MA thesis in the form of a comic, which I think is really exciting. But your comment about also the explosion of moving too fast, too quickly, too fast. Is there a danger in then an explosion of more academic, hybrid work, intermediate work, and especially since there aren't many models of comic?
Well, I think there are two very good models, Unflattening being the most recent, but Understanding Comics is, yeah. It's like anything else. I don't necessarily decry the fact that comics studies texts are exploding, but it's like, who's watching the Watchmen? I think we don't need to publish everything, but an MA thesis, yeah, of course. Why shouldn't it be done as a comic, so long as it fulfills the requirement of an MA thesis? Yeah. Yeah, I don't really see a danger there. In fact, it's kind of exciting to me, because you add this entire new dimension, words and pictures, so I think, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Obviously, so Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics is obviously, of his three, the most well-known. But following that, and I think it was 2002, was Reinventing Comics with his 12 Revolutions. I'm thinking about the final 3 revolutions about digital comics, and specifically about how people have that kind of caused such controversy within the industry at the time, and how kind of pushed away people have sort of left the 3 final revolutions that McCloud talks about. Do you see digital comics theory as something burgeoning that's starting to come out? Do you see a future for that, or?
Definitely a future for that. I haven't. The woman sitting next to you probably knows more than I do about this, because I don't read digital comics. I'm old, and I'm of a generation that didn't grow up with computers. I love print, and when I sit down at the computer, it's work. So if I have to read comics on a computer, it feels more like work to me. So I don't, I seldom read digital comics, but it's certainly the way of the future, no question of that,
Do you see, because I guess I see them, I think that sometimes we see, or some people think of digital comics as like the successor of the print comic, right? And there's that antagonistic relationship that's put out there. But like, I see them more as simultaneous mediums that can function together.
Yeah,
and is
I agree. Certainly at Dark Horse, when we first began digitizing our comics there, though I don't like that, they were reformatted for the phone, and I think you destroy something really important by losing the page. I think you destroy a fundamental unit of storytelling, as I was saying, but there was kind of a hue and cry from some people who said, no, this is really going to cut into our comic book sales. And in fact, it proved the opposite. We had more people buying our comics than ever. Some people buying print, some people buying digital, and of those people buying digital, if they liked it enough and wanted to preserve it forever on their bookshelf, and they had a bookshelf, then they went and bought the print version too. And also worked other ways in that a lot of the junior editors at Dark Horse were reading comics online, were reading web comics, and were really excited by those, and so invited those web cartoonists to have their stuff published, put in print, you know, in a long-term format kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't see it. I don't. Certainly doesn't need to be an antagonistic relationship at all. No. You're quite right about that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question regarding your work as an editor, if that's okay.
Sure.
More specifically, Robotech, the macro saga.
Oh, God.
Edited for Comico in the 1980s. Because I've read that the color separation process, or at least some aspect of the coloring or color printing for Robotech was in some way different or more elaborate or more advanced than for other comics. Do you know anything about that?
Well, look, back from the 1940s through the 1970s, comics were colored using the four-color process, and that was a mechanical process at the time, which means that for comics were not made digitally, they were made with film, just like your old film cameras, you know, film negatives of your photos would go to a printer and they would output a positive print of the photo that you'd taken. Comics were made the same way. We created big film negatives and those went to a printer and they output positive copies on paper. So, but for every area of color that you saw on the page, that color was hand cut by a hand separator, usually housewives working part-time. So there were only 64 colors available from 1938 through to the 70s. It was a cheap process. It was CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And there were percentages of each color were 100%, 50%, 10%. I'm actually forgetting what the percentages were, but basically it worked out by permutation and combination to a total of 64 colors. Those were your established colors. You could not choose any others. And come the late 70s and 80s, Comico added some percentages, specifically percentages of black, because I think black could only be run at 100% before then. So we added what's called a K-tone, both 10% and 20% of black. And then we added a whole other percentage of all colors, of the cyan, magenta, and yellow. And that upped the number through mathematical combination and permutation. That upped the number to 300 and something or other. But of course now with digital separation, you can choose any percentage of those four colors. So your choices are not quite infinite, but close. But that was the intermediate step of sort of adding a percentage of the three colors, and that meant you could just combine them in so many more different ways. And especially the K-tones, you could, when you look at those comics from the 40s, it's all primary colors. There's no subtlety to the coloring. There's nothing moody and yeah, we added that and allowed our comics, not Robotech, to have a little more atmosphere. Yeah. Robotech was the very first comic I ever edited. So, you know, just like any cartoonist who looks back at their first work. Yeah.
Explain one thing that Robotech, the cartoon was based off of was 3 different anime series from Japan. Macross and I believe Southern Cross was named together. And then there's a 3rd one, and then they just edited them together so that way they could merchandise things like comic books or toys and stuff for kids and stuff, because in the 80s they didn't regulate ads and stuff.
So, and yeah, we published the 3 Robotech series as separate.
Oh, Macross, were they original series made in America, or were they translations of the original shop on the manga?
No, they were original series made in America.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Macross and
yeah,
Macross.
yeah.
Time for one more.
Yeah, I wondered if you could speak a little bit to, I mean, I appreciate the concerns you expressed about English profs in general, I guess is mainly the thing. English profs using comics without knowing how to read comics or teaching comics.
But you know, I'm an English prof
Yeah, I
now,
know.
so
But that's okay, that's neither here nor there. The question was, if you see any harm in somebody using comics to teach something, not necessarily teaching comics, but to use them, for instance, if a high school teacher is doing a course on war and they insert 2 comics text, they're very different than teaching comics for
right, yeah.
them.
No, I get what you're saying. My sister is a high school teacher. My younger sister is a high school teacher. She's married to a cartoonist. She knows nothing, cares nothing really about comics except the fact that Batman bought her a nice house. And she's been trying forever to get Persepolis into her curriculum. And I think because there's a tiny little penis in there in some panels, she's had some trouble. But she did manage to get it in, and she's certainly not using it to teach comics. But I think if you're going to use comics, no matter what the focus of your course is, I think you have to address the visual in some capacity, because comics don't just tell stories through words. Pictures do a lot of the heavy lifting of telling the story. And so I think, you know, if you're going to be discussing the story that you have your students read in a comic, you have to talk about the visual. If you don't talk about the visual, A, I'm not sure why you're reading the comic, and B, I think you're missing out on something really important. You're missing out on part of the way the story's being told. Which is not to say you have to, like me, spend your entire life studying comics, you know. I mean, it's such a niche little genre that yeah, I don't know anything about anything else, but I know a lot about comics. But no, you don't have to do that, but I think it's important to learn a little something about it, certainly to read MacLeod, and again, to understand how the images are working to tell that story and not just the words. So, yeah.
That is our time for this afternoon. Thank you so much, Diane.
Everybody for coming here and listening to me rant. I really appreciate it.
If you'd like to chat further with Diana, you can do so at the Artist Alley table right behind us.